Let's face it, the average American is inundated by a ceaseless barrage of info overload, multi-sourced distractions, insecurity, fear, and an ongoing parade of contradictory observations which literally paralyze the mortal mind.
Chaos is actually mostly caused by man-made ideology, basically. Like chaos of Stalin killing how many people because of the doctrine of communism, right? And Mao Zedong killing so many Chinese, where people are starving and eating dust.
Our population is striving to swim against the current of an electromagnetic tidal wave of social media. 3, 4, and 5G networks, smartphones, smart meters, and smart cities. Pollution, concentrated energy weapons, and a psychic cocktail of biodiversity mania that undermines the very soul of humanity. Chemtrails and GMO foods from spooky organizations. Vaccinations and psych drugs from Big Pharma. Mass-produced private propaganda from mainstream media, and undeclared wars from rogues in Congress. Yes, life in the U.S. Republic has become little different than ancient Rome.
Whether it's ancient Rome or the United States. When the state becomes very powerful, that power itself, it acts like a magnet. And the magnet attracts to it the predator class. And people who want to prey upon others, who want them to serve them, they're attracted to the state because the state gives them the power to do that, and to do it in a legal form.
A plethora of power-grabbing control freaks now rule the U.S. empire. A parade of pedophiles and seats of power, from clergy to movie executives. False authorities in a runaway government hijacked by cultural Marxism and corporate fascism in the guise of political parties. Is it any wonder our youth, hatched from a liberal arts-infested academia, is screaming for socialism and universal basic income? The endless psychobabble of every failed political philosopher from Rousseau to Comte and Malthus?
The absolute worst of our species has come to essentially rule the rest of the human masses.
The animals are out of the barn and all over the farm. Everyone's uniqueness must be equal. Social justice and political correctness are the order of the day. Against this background, why wouldn't elites desire to usher in some new world order? An order to protect us, to save the environment, save the world. The only question that stands between such altruism and an impossible dream is the Hegelian dialect.
Now, one of the earliest philosophers of modern day socialist or communist totalitarianism was the philosopher Hegel. And he wrote an enormous encyclopedia of philosophy. And the concept of dialectic, which of course comes from classical times, was intended to be a method of reaching agreement between disputants.
Thesis, the initial idea. The antithesis, the contradiction of the initial idea. And then the synthesis, which in some sense is the composition of elements of both the thesis and the antithesis.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
People in power create a problem so that they can present the solution to the problem.
Did these elites create the chaos in the first place? Many preeminent conspiracy researchers say they did.
The Hegelian dialectic is, in my opinion, at the heart and soul of our political morass. The government will create one position, and then it will create a problem that will counter that position, thus creating conflict between the positions. And then the government itself will come in and offer the solution.
Not only have global elites, what C. Wright Mills calls the power elite, caused the chaos, they put their plan to resolve the chaos in writing.
So if you look today at the power elite, whether Mills emphasized this or not, who would be at the top of the pyramid of power? Well, it would be the bankers and the financiers.
Ultra, mega, super rich people who have as an overriding agenda for their life to implement a one-world government by the end of the century.
And kids from Hollywood-nurtured academia, tomorrow's voters, are going to have no problem with a socialist world government, especially if it's for the greater good of the environment. So, if the globalists' plan to improve the world generates some Green New Deal, no Bernie Sanders voter or Elizabeth Warren groupie is going to complain.
And that is why we're in chaos, and that is why we have to reject this illegitimate notion of authority and really understand the difference between right and wrong under natural law, and then re-evaluate and align our behavior to natural law.
Given few are alert about the globalists' agenda, let's take a look at the plan and see if it will improve or dominate the world, as so-called conspiracy theorists are warning.
First of all, conspiracy theory is a view of reality that acknowledges that there are hidden forces at work in society, and that the people who are making things happen don't want the common folks to know about it. They have a hidden agenda, like hidden agendas in government and in the media, in the schools. So conspiracy theory is not anything except a propaganda phrase to encourage people not to listen to the information that's being presented.
Fortunately, the plan is all there in an easy-to-read 351-page document entitled Agenda 21.
Agenda 21 is a 351-page document, and obviously if anyone can go on the internet and see it, common sense would tell us that it could not be a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy fact.
In reading Clause 1.1 of the preamble, it's obvious Agenda 21 was written by lawyers. Given this, we now know that 99% of the global population, plus the illiterate, will probably not read it. Then, Clause 1.2 makes it clear that Agenda 21 is a global partnership, an innocent partnership built on a resolution from the UN's Friendly General Assembly.
All members of the United Nations belong to the General Assembly. Only a few belong to the Security Council compared to the 193 as General Assembly. The United States has a veto, but rarely exercises the veto. They go ahead and they accept whatever the UN wants to be done, and our ambassador to the United Nations, usually a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, will go along with almost anything.
Clause 1.3 goes on to say that the agenda reflects a global consensus, and its implementation is first and foremost the responsibility of governments. By reading the first three clauses, any intelligent citizen can see that Agenda 21 is not only a plan and a partnership, but a call for governments of the world to unite. Sound familiar? Earlier, didn't Karl Marx, founder of communism, call for workers of the world to unite? The idea of uniting to overthrow capitalism and its middle class.
Karl Marx is known for his theory of Marxism and economics, where largely government controls the means of production and the power of the economy is not invested in the creativity of the individual, but invested more in government, and it's a top-down control of our economy as opposed to being driven by the people themselves.
So communism died. Or did it? Sounds like the United Nations has resurrected communism and repackaged it as Agenda 21. After all, what could be better than a planet-wide central system of government control to ensure better protected and managed ecosystems, as stated in Clause 1.1?
Central planning is a concept in totalitarian regimes by which all decision-making and all power and all wealth are held not by individual families, not by corporations, but only by the state. The state therefore takes all decisions, decides how every town and village should be planned, how it should look, how everything that moves and has its being in the country shall be directed from the center.
Let's take a closer look at just the United Nations itself, the organization that hatched Agenda 21, and see what some of its founding principles are. Let's start with the UN's Declaration of Human Rights and see how it compares with the U.S. Bill of Rights.
In our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, we are very much told by the Founding Fathers that our rights come from God, that they are inalienable rights given to us by our Creator. The UN Declaration of Rights has no mention of God, no mention of a higher authority. The UN sees itself as the higher authority.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Not only based on human rights, but it's based on natural law.
Surely, if the UN is calling for its 193 governments to partner, they will be partnering behind worthwhile principles. Principles similar to the principles in the U.S. Constitution, a document that facilitated the creation of the freest and wealthiest nation that has ever existed. A nation that millions of people migrate to in order to escape their UN member nations.
The Bill of Rights is a set of absolutes. Here they are. You can't do this, and this, and there's no exception clause. Whereas the Declaration of Human Rights in the UN system specifically says, well, these rights can be exercised as long as they don't conflict with the purposes and goals of the United Nations. Well, who determines that? Well, the political people that are operating the United Nations.
We see that the following words are prominent in the U.S. Bill of Rights: petition, probable cause, trial by jury, due process, unreasonable searches, excessive bail, free state. But when we search for these words in the UN's declaration, none of them are present.
These are among the backbone of constitutional government and personal liberty. If you eliminate those, you basically have eliminated the essence of American liberty. Government is not seen in the American tradition as the grantor of rights, but rather as the protector of rights.
If you were to take the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, you will see two vastly different documents. One of them protects rights that are ours, God-given. The other one gives rights and then qualifies those rights out of existence.
I don't know about you, but this is a little creepy. A Bill of Rights for a 193 government partnership that has no mention of the right to petition, no mention of probable cause, no mention of trial by jury, no mention of due process, and no mention of freedom from unreasonable searches. The UN Declaration sounds like a recipe for a police state. But even scarier, it sounds like a recipe for a really big police state.
Jails, prisons, fines, death penalties if necessary. A police state is where its primary characteristic is that the police are at your doorstep. The police are telling you what to do, or at least they're to make sure you do it after the politicians tell you what to do. So a police state is a totalitarian state. What we need to do is get rid of the police component of the state. Let's make the state something to protect us, not to police us.
Out of the 195 countries in the world, the UN has 193 governments of these countries signed up to forward their non-binding agenda. That's a lot of governments, and none of them, or their people, are being advised to have a Bill of Rights that says anything about petition, probable cause, trial by jury, due process, unreasonable searches, excessive bail, or free states.
And you can read through most of each of these documents, but they also say then, but we can pass a law to suspend it. You can't suspend a Bill of Rights, anything in the Bill of Rights in the United States.
If this is the UN's view of human rights, it sounds like their agenda is not only a plan for a police state, but a global police state.
A globalist totalitarian society would look something like Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany on steroids. And it would be comprised of a large population of order followers that would be willing to carry out the commands of oligarchical elitists at the top of the food chain of power.
The worst thing is, nowhere in the UN's declaration is the right to keep and bear arms, or the right to own real estate, what the founders called private property. These omissions guarantee what we're looking at could really be nasty, especially if the wrong people got in there to rule.
When you look at the basic liberties of man protected in the Constitution, firearms ownership and property rights are two of the most essential freedoms. They are, in many ways, two of the things that separate America from most of the rest of the world.
But global police state aside, if bearing arms and owning private property are missing, this also guarantees the UN's goal of combating poverty is impossible. Worse, if the UN knows this goal is impossible, because it knows people cannot get out of poverty unless they are free to own and register real estate, the agenda set forth in Agenda 21 is absolutely bogus.
Private property ownership is the greatest force in eliminating poverty. Where else do the average people have to build a substantial amount of wealth other than their property? Private property ownership, the equity in private property, is the means to create new businesses. 60% of American businesses were started by people using equity in their private property, and 60% of the American people were employed. And that's how we build an economy. That's how the United States, being one of the only countries in the world that really protected private property, became as wealthy and as free as it did in such a short period of time.
And just as bad as depriving people of the ability to feed themselves is depriving them of the ability to protect themselves. This is why the Founding Fathers clearly state in the American Bill of Rights that a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. Therefore, the right of the people to keep and bear arms cannot be infringed.
The author, who we believe is Richard Henry Lee, said, it is essential to the preservation of liberty that the whole body of the people be trained. Okay, that's what well-regulated means. It means well-trained. And it doesn't mean government-regulated, in spite of what the government politicians and lawyers say. So essential to the preservation of liberty is having a well-trained body of people. Remember, he says the whole body of the people who are present and ready at a moment's notice.
But since the UN's Bill of Rights makes no mention of the right to keep and bear arms, one can only assume that the people in most of the UN's member nations do not have the right to keep and bear arms. Hence, none of them are on the way to being a free state, another term that's missing.
If the United Nations eliminates gun ownership and property rights or real estate ownership, the implications simply are this: we are then brought into bondage and we become hopeless and helpless because we will not be able to defend ourselves, our lives, our liberty, or our families.
If people are denied the right to private property and to arms, they will not be free. The idea behind this is that private property includes your person, and it extends to the idea that you can defend your body, your private property, as necessary. So the notion of these ideas is key to the establishment of America and to America's success to date.
So why is the United States one of the member states of the United Nations? This is a major outpoint and one that we, the people of the United States, should take a serious look at. If the UN's agenda is to partner, unite all the governments of Earth, and people do not have the right to keep and bear arms, who gets to keep and bear arms? Easy, all of the governments.
Is the arms-bearing stratum of society the mass of the people themselves, or is it some select group? And if it's some select group, who controls the ability of that select group to use those arms potentially against the rest of society? That's always been the conflict throughout history, right? Because what is government? I think Washington says this. Government is not eloquence. Government is force. That's the final analysis. And the armed stratum of society is the one that exercises that force. And the people who exercise force, the ultimate force in society, are considered what? The sovereigns. And under our system of government, the sovereigns are the people themselves. Therefore, they must have the ultimate control over force, and that's done through the militia structure.
So no guns and no real estate recommended in the UN's agenda for the 21st century. If this is the plan, it means there will be no free states and poverty will never go away. It means not only world domination, but universal poverty. Here is what the experts tell us about the cycle of poverty. A nation of people that is denied the right to own real estate, again, commonly referred to as private property, will never be able to generate wealth.
Private property is the most important element of our freedom. Private property in terms of real estate is extremely important because it gives us an opportunity to increase our wealth, to use it as an asset both in a productive way and also as collateral. So all free nations allow for and support the ownership of private property.
Most of the people in the world are in poverty because their UN member governments will not permit them to easily own and record or register real estate.
And what's been proven over and over again is those types of economy generate less wealth by essentially orders of magnitude than the entrepreneurial so-called capitalist economy, which is based, in part at least, on the ownership of land.
It takes 20 years before most real estate ownership can be recorded in Mexico. In Peru, it takes 289 days to legally register a business and a registration fee of $1,200, a year's income for most in that country. In the Philippines, it takes 168 steps involving 53 public and private agencies to register real estate. If an individual cannot record or register his ownership of real estate, that owner cannot borrow against his real estate. Banks will not loan money on real estate unless they can determine clear title of ownership.
Because it creates chaos. I mean, who are they lending the money to and for what purpose? And so there's just absolutely no security whatsoever in doing that. And we have all of our property registered. And then that's how you get equity in your property, and that's how you can prove ownership, and it's a legal situation.
Real estate titles, for instance, they are simply legal recognitions of who owns what. So that we're have the ability to say, at this particular time, this particular plot of land described in a certain way is owned by Mr. Jones, and then Jones can transfer title through the normal process of contract, property law, to others. And we have a record of who's who and what's what in terms of particular plots of land.
If banks won't lend on home equity, people cannot borrow money to start businesses. If people cannot start businesses, they cannot employ people who are starving or in poverty. Small businesses employ 90% of the population in a typical capitalist country. This is what happens in Western civilization, and why the United States has more wealth than the other UN member nations.
America's greatness has nothing to do with the power of our army. The uniqueness and the greatness of America is that we are the only nation in the world where every individual, every American, has the absolute right to own property. And it is that right of ownership that allows them to utilize and extract the wealth from the property they own.
Poor individuals and poor nations are thus never able to remedy their poverty because their governments suppress real solutions. Why do you think 20 million Mexicans have illegally flooded into the U.S.? They are in poverty. Why are they in poverty? No real estate.
So ultimately, land ownership is one of the basic aspects of freedom in any society. That's why you see in the typical communist socialist societies, say under Stalin and Mao Zedong, what was one of the first things they did? They collectivized as much as possible the land, put it under the control of the Communist Party.
Give a man a fish, but never show him how to fish. The socialists' answer to poverty is always the same. The rich, productive individual must give money to the poor, impoverished individual. And the UN's answer is similar. The rich, productive nation must give foreign aid to the poor, impoverished nation. It's called the redistribution of wealth under the doctrine of social equity.
Social equity is one of the 3 pillars of United Nations Agenda 21, Sustainable Development. And the idea is that the world is not fair. And so it's necessary to make the world fair by redistributing wealth, whether it's in terms of assets or technology, whatever it is that the developed nations need to give to the lesser developed nations in order to equalize their economies and their opportunities.
The socialists don't understand that well-being, security, standard of living comes from production. They don't understand that. They think that it comes from political edict. Socialists and other collectivists think that all they have to do is say, we're going to give every man, woman, and child a minimum wage or give them a certain level of health care or an education. They never think about where it comes from. They think all it takes is a bunch of politicians sitting around a table and voting for it. If we vote for it, well then bingo, it happens. They don't understand that if you do that and you take away the ability for those who create the wealth to maintain it, then they're going to stop creating wealth. And then nobody will have anything. So the only way you can have equality in a system is equality in poverty.
Take note, people of the developing world. You can generate wealth. You just need to assert your right to own real estate and guns to ensure these rights.
The citizens of every country in the world should demand the right to keep and bear arms because they are supposed to be the ones in charge first. You have to take responsibility for your own protection, your own self-defense, and for your own community's self-defense.
If people are denied the right to private property and to arms, they will not be free. And that's why America was such a unique formulation in the history of the world. It is the first country to recognize unalienable rights. Those unalienable rights are innumerable, but they certainly start with the idea that you have the right to the use and enjoyment of your property. And it extends to the idea that you can defend your property.
Since guns and property rights are omitted from the UN's agenda and its Declaration of Human Rights, a theory about its ultimate political aims can be postulated. With no property rights or guns, and all of the governments on Earth united, Agenda 21 is nothing less than a plan for the total and complete enslavement of humanity.
If universal but private property is denied to the people, they become immediately mere vassals of the state. One of the things I did when working for Margaret Thatcher was to devise a method which would allow ordinary people living in state-owned housing to buy that off the state at a preferential rate. Because if it denies them the right of private property and the right to own and use firearms, then it can rule over them absolutely without any fear of argument or contradiction.
The implications of the UN's Declaration of Human Rights not mentioning certain things like property rights is an indication that it is a rights-granting entity. So if we don't mention it, you can't do it.
And this is being done in the name of the environment, equality, and economy. What's known as the 3 E's found in Agenda 21 and its sister update, Agenda 2030. Environment. Pass endless executive orders and regulations to save the environment, even if it means the destruction of the U.S. manufacturing base.
Well, environment in my own sense and in the scientific sense, I would say the entirety of the sort of Earth system in the most natural way. I would even say that human is part of the environment, which means we are the natural product. In fact, most of the time, the funny part is when people are saying that, human is sort of external to this climate system or the environment. We are as natural as naturalness come, in my humble opinion.
In the context of Agenda 21, what it means is that no species has any more rights than any other species, and that human beings are responsible for the planet in the sense that it is a single entity. So this concept of the one world allows for control of a single entity, and it actually enables that. It justifies the single world concept in terms of political, economic, and social controls.
Equality. redistribute the wealth of nations and the wealth of individuals so everyone is equally poor, even if it means the destruction of the American middle class.
That's the idea for bringing the lesser developed nations up, and then to lower the wages in the more developed nations, because in fact you don't really need to have any more than whatever it takes to purchase whatever it is that the mega corporations are selling. So if you have savings, you have too much.
Economy. Print fiat money and practice fractional reserve banking to unjustly enrich the power elite, even if it means destroying the free market system. Yes, these are the three dimensions of what the UN calls sustainable development, a term coined in 1987 by the Brundtland Commission in a publication called Our Common Future.
The term sustainable development, according to the United Nations and the Gru Harlem Brundtland Commission, who wrote this book called Our Common Future, is the development that meets the needs of the present but doesn't sacrifice the needs of future generations. It's not about the abundance that we have here on planet Earth. It's about creating scarcity using fear-mongering tactics. One is, man-made anthropogenic global warming, or that farmers and ranchers are using 70% of the world's water for agriculture. These things are not true, but we're being told that, our cars' emissions as we drive our cars around are causing so much degradation to planet Earth that within 10 years, by the year 2030, we all must live sustainably and live a sustainable development lifestyle and get out of our cars and walk, bike, and take public transportation and be happy about it to save the trees, to save the biodiversity, to save the world from people like you and me.
And of course then they did decide that yes, everything that human beings are doing now does compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And so the General Commission said to the World Commission on Environment and Development, well, can you come back in 5 years with the action plan to implement sustainable development worldwide? And that is exactly what they did.
Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Bear in mind, the word development refers to the term real estate development. And recall what we said about the UN's ideal for real estate. Only governments and the power elite get to own it. To them, that's what is sustainable. Their ownership.
What it really means is control of the environment, protecting the environment. And so no matter what your situation is, the environment comes in first. One of the interesting things about doing that is that the environment does not follow political boundaries. Rivers run through a whole lot of towns. So sustainable development is a scam that's set up to pretend like it's government. And what it does is eliminate political boundaries. And that means we're losing our liberty, and we're changing our system of government. We're losing our ability to elect our local officials.
So what else could top brass at UN headquarters in New York City, home of the globalists' propaganda networks and the bankers' fiat Federal Reserve, possibly be thinking? How can the needs of future generations be met if only the elite in the UN's 193 signatory governments can own real estate?
For whatever reason, perhaps it's part of their genetic code, but they are predators. They really want everybody else to work for them and to be their slaves, and they don't have any sensibility about or compassion for them. They just want to rule. And those are the ones that always gravitate for political power, because it gives them the option to acquire and feed these passions, acquire what they want and feed these passions, and not be thrown in prison, because they're the ones that run the prisons. So we go back to the question of the UN, which is the motivation, and I think it's both. Probably most of the people at the UN, certainly I'm going to guess around 97%, really want the best for their fellow citizens of the world. The other 3% probably figure I'm going to be the rulers. I'm going to be part of the ruling class. It's going to be cool for me, and a little piece of that, they're actually psychopaths, and they're going to make sure that their passions for cruelty are satisfied.
Seems like the real plan is to keep the present and future generations in poverty and dependent on an ever-expanding police state. Is that our common future? Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, and Obama all signed on to Agenda 21. These same presidents, delivered by both the Democratic and Republican parties, are working for world government envisioned by the globalists.
The beginnings of the world government already exist in the World Trade Organization, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the new International Environmental Authority, Kyoto. All of these things are the embryonic institutions of a world government. And at the end of the road, nations will lose their sovereignty and independence and basically become like Pennsylvania and Maryland are in the United States of America, which is states which have fundamentally lost enormous amounts of their national sovereignty.
This is why the emergence of Donald Trump has caused such alarm. Trump is restoring the nationalism our rogue presidents are trying to steal from we the people. That said, let's take a closer look into Agenda 21 and its precedents and spawns to see if there is any more evidence supporting the theory that globalists and psychopaths in governments are trying to dominate the world using poverty and environment as the bait. The concept of sustainable development through better stewardship of the environment did not always exist. A series of events, conferences, and publications finally led the power elite to the rationale for adopting sustainable development as the UN's unifying principle. In 1918, at the conclusion of World War I, Randolph Bourne wrote, "War is the health of the state." Little did he know how unifying that statement would turn out to be.
The phrase war is the health of the state essentially means that as the rulers of a society can pit people against each other effectively, they are gaining strategic power over the rest of the population, because what war essentially does to any given population where it is being waged or conducted is it depletes that population of necessary resources, it depletes them of their prosperity, it puts them into a extreme consciousness of fear, and it sets them divided against each other. This is part of the ancient ruling class strategy of divide and conquer.
Ostensibly determined to end all wars, the power elite launched the League of Nations in 1920 from Geneva, Switzerland. Its mission? To achieve international peace and security by the acceptance of obligations not to resort to war. But then, in 1939, World War II happened anyway.
League of Nations was set up as the result of the war to end all wars, World War I, right? The principle of the League of Nations was we're not going to have any more wars because all the countries are going to get together and work out their differences in some kind of pseudo-parliamentary fashion. And then, of course, what happened? Well, the League of Nations were not able to control the situation, and you had the greatest war that had ever occurred, World War II.
The power elite disbanded the League of Nations and in 1945 launched the United Nations from San Francisco. A year later, John D. Rockefeller Jr. donated an $8.5 million parcel of land to build a permanent headquarters for the UN in New York City. Though the building was new, the United Nations had basically the same old mission: prevent the scourge of war. Unfortunately, or no surprise, from 1945 to 1966, the scourge of war intensified.
The United Nations, which is supposedly the perfection of the League of Nations, and we've had more wars going on, small scale of course, but you add them all up, there have been more bombs dropped and probably more people killed and more destruction than in all of World War II.
With the advent of the first atomic bomb used on Hiroshima, not only would wars continue, weapons themselves would continue to develop, thus giving rise to what President Dwight D. Eisenhower would call the military-industrial complex.
It's a combination of the military, the standing army of the United States, and the industrial corporations that tie into it through the production of goods and services the military uses.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
And of course Eisenhower foresaw that this would expand, and the armed forces would want to expand their role, the corporations would want to expand their role, and the influence of the two would come together to control the direction of foreign policy primarily. And now we've gotten to the point where this complex consumes the vast majority of the federal budget.
54% of the budget, US budget, going to military. And we have over 750 bases around the globe. More than 500 bases are energy related. So just imagine how we can live in this country if we don't have all these problems. Yes, we have to protect ourselves. We have to be very strong, but in our land. We don't have to go around and do this, what we're doing now. Just because of energy, what we don't need it. We don't need to import energy from anybody. We don't need to do all this work, what we're doing now, for anybody else.
American leadership is not just respected, it is required.
War is extremely profitable. You think of the industries that are involved in war. When you think of the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that are getting a piece of the pie financially whenever a country goes to war. You think about the fortunes that have been made by the suffering and death of people involved in war. War enriches innumerable individuals and companies.
By 1967, it became clear that wars were not only profitable, they were going to continue, and the UN had no workable plan to stop them. This frustration may have been the reason a book entitled Report from Iron Mountain emerged as a New York Times bestseller and was translated into 15 languages.
And it was an analysis, supposedly, of how do you establish and promote and preserve peace and stability in the modern world. Well, then we find out what it means by peace and stability. Stability in their mind meant stability of government, and peace meant no opposition to government. And so the study really was about how do you design a system in the modern world in which governments don't have to worry about the people revolting against them.
Supposedly written by a secret government panel of 15 insiders, the book spoke openly about the role of war in sustaining governmental power.
And it talked about the different ways of keeping the people docile and mentally prepared to endure any kind of an insult to their personal liberty or their dignity. And that meant to get them involved in a war.
The report inferred that the reason the League of Nations nor the United Nations could prevent wars was because war actually provided vital functions to human civilization. War generates economic advantages. It ensures stability because it's the foundation of governmental authority. It controls military institutions necessary for allegiance and obedience. It motivates advancements in science and technology. And most importantly, it thins out populations. In other words, war is not only profitable, it's good.
Yes, it is profitable for people what they're selling the weapons. It is profitable. But what about regular American person? Why is the sense?
When you think of the destruction, not just of property and of countries and economies, the massive death and destruction of individuals, the carnage of war, etc., is more horrible than most of us could realize.
War brings more government and moral decline. And anything that would generate a situation where war would be preferable is something that somebody else generated, and We, the people, are the victims.
Unfortunately, war is only good if a government can blow up just a few thousand people and only a small part of their city. Thus, to the power elite, even destruction of a city like Hiroshima, along with 80,000 people, is tolerable as a form of conventional warfare, or what might even be called population control. But all of this changed on November 1st, 1952, when the first hydrogen bomb was tested on the Marshall Islands in the North Pacific Ocean.
Yes, when everyone has the same absolute maximum killing capacity in a hydrogen bomb, that would be the mutually assured destruction. So therefore, it's a weapon that becomes more a psychological weapon than a military weapon. Those who have it have the advantage psychologically over those who do not have it.
Tesla ultimately had two overarching solutions to the problem of war. The first was his implementation of free electrical energy anywhere on the surface of the earth. Now, that would have taken people out of a mentality of scarcity over which almost all wars are fought. The second was he envisioned providing highly advanced technology, not just to one nation, but to all nations, similar to what we talk about in nuclear war as mutually assured destruction.
This bomb, and the arsenal of similar bombs that would surely follow, marked the end of what would become known as the war system. Whatever benefits the war system may have had, war with hydrogen bombs was not practical. Destruction would be so great, even the UN's member governments would be annihilated.
All of these military adventures have been at the conventional level, and they've been kept at the conventional level because of the existence of nuclear weapons. So they've had to turn away from the concept that that level of warfare could be used to advance various goals because the destruction involved in it would be so great.
Destroying people and personal property are one thing, but when the power elite and their governments are also annihilated, that's inhumane. Given this, the founders of the League of Nations and the United Nations were probably the first to read Report from Iron Mountain because they quickly realized they could no longer use the profitable war system to maintain governmental authority. Something new had to be devised. By 1967, a replacement for the war system was on the minds of not only UN bureaucrats, but the heads of state, high-level politicians, government officials, diplomats, scientists, economists, and business leaders from around the world. In short, the power elite was now desperate to find a new unifying principle.
And they looked at things like, possibly we could create, we could make everybody believe that we were under attack from aliens from outer space. Now that would scare the dickens out of everybody. They certainly would be willing to undergo any kind of sacrifice and loss of freedoms if it was necessary to defend Earth against Martians or something like that. And they talked about it at great length. That they said, very interesting possibility. Let's consider that. Let's not put that off the table.
Then, in 1968, Aurelio Pache, David Rockefeller, and Alexander King founded an organization they called the Club of Rome.
Founded by members of the great and the good, members of the, to use the conspiratorial terms, the globalist elite, who produce fatuous documents from time to time, echoing the various mantras and nostrums of socialism or communism at a particular moment.
The club floundered around for a few years trying to solve the problems of mankind. But then, in 1972, it revised an idea spawned by Thomas Malthus in 1798. Malthus was an English scholar who wrote a book entitled An Essay on the Principle of Population. Basically, the principle was this: every time the human race invented a way to produce more food, it used the abundance to increase its population rather than improve its living standard. Thus, humanity never advanced like it could if a small elite were ruling a modestly populated world.
Malthusianism was, in a sense, the theory or counsel of despair, that as people gained technological knowledge to produce more food, that would make them to a certain extent more healthy, and they could reproduce at a faster rate as opposed to dying off quickly. And the population would then expand, potentially geometrically, and this would outrun food production, and so you had this vicious circle which could never be corrected.
The club, using computers of the day to extrapolate not only population growth but resource depletion, came up with a twist on Malthus and published it in a book entitled The Limits to Growth. Like Report from Iron Mountain, Limits to Growth was also a bestseller. The twist was this: human populations grew exponentially while food populations only grew linearly.
And the Malthusian population model, which is a simple equation, simply says that if there's enough resources, the population will go on doubling until there isn't enough resources.
In other words, the human race was going to run out of food and deplete its resources. This, the club warned, would lead to a sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity by the year 2072. Very plausible, many thought. After all, when Malthus wrote Essay on the Principle of Population, the world population was only 800 million. Now, when the Club of Rome published Limits to Growth, the world population was 3.8 billion and still growing exponentially. Given that war could no longer be used as a unifying principle, perhaps the threats posed by overpopulation would fit the bill. This idea excited the power elite and initiated a UN conference in 1976 in Vancouver, Canada, known as Habitat 1.
This was the beginning of a series of meetings that they had at the UN starting clear back in the 1970s.
And this is where sustainable development was defined as human beings must not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs.
It was kind of an intellectual way of explaining why the world needed world government, because without world government, individual governments couldn't handle all of these really big problems that now needed to be solved on a global scale.
So they will have resolutions and they will take actions that will impede the population growth of the world. Let's get back to basic freedoms given us by God Almighty, which is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence.
Out of this conference materialized a 54-page report called the Vancouver Declaration on Human Settlements, more of which we will discuss later. This report outlined a theory of how to address overpopulation's effects on the environment and natural resources, a way to balance the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of future generations. Again, what they called sustainable development.
Now, it was realized very early on that population wasn't growing as fast as Malthus had predicted, and that what's more, the natural resources we were able to command and the increase in yield from crops, for instance, was far greater than anything he had ever factored in. The one thing that actually works is to raise the standard of living. And of course, that is the one thing that the various globalists and population freaks are desperate to stop. They don't realize that by making people poor and keeping people poor, they do create a population problem which would immediately cease if they made people rich and allowed them to be rich and allowed them to hold their own property.
Finally, it was decided. Sustainable development was to be the new unifying principle to replace the war system. All of this, Malthus, World War I, League of Nations, World War II, United Nations, atomic bomb, hydrogen bomb, Iron Mountain, Club of Rome, Vancouver Declaration, and Brundtland Commission are the stepping stones to Agenda 21, the action plan for sustainable development.
In 1992, in June, George H.W. Bush signed or agreed to the United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development Plan.
It was a bad night in Rio. Before the ink had dried on Agenda 21, Bush 1 had signed the document.
It was not a treaty, it was not a law, it was what they call soft law. It's not something that actually is debated by Congress or by state legislatures, but it's implemented through the federal branches, through the HUD and EPA and OSHA, and also through state governments and county governments. If you brought back a treaty, the Senate would have voted on it, it would have been debated, there would have been information about it, and I would think it would have been voted down.
It was also a bad night for the United States, because on that night, in the year 1992, we the people were enjoined with what would become the largest land grab in history.
There were 50,000 delegates there, and of those 50,000 delegates in Rio de Janeiro, there were 179 heads of state, including George H.W. Bush, and plus diplomats and UN executives and so forth, and this massive number of non-governmental organizations that wrote these documents in the first place.
They designed Agenda 21 to be a, quote, voluntary agreement, not a treaty. So it didn't have to go before Congress, it didn't have to go anywhere, it just got done by President Bush's signature. What happened when he signed it was it mobilized every federal agency to adopt plans, programs, and mass amounts of money to the implementation of Agenda 21 on a local basis.
Zoning laws of every imaginable type on every level of government would soon be marching across rural and suburban America in the name of sustainable development.
And this was a bad night, because what he was signing on to and saying, hey, this is a great idea, he was completely going against the Constitution of the United States, the freedoms that it was designed to protect, private property, free enterprise, individual choice. George Washington would have whacked him in the head.
Then, in 1993, non-binding Agenda 21 became binding when Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12852, launching the President's Council of Sustainable Development.
And it was tasked with implementing all of the plan within the United States. So although you'll hear that this is a dusty plan that's not really, it's voluntary, it's non-binding. In fact, this plan is binding on you.
They said, oh, this is just voluntary. If a community wants to follow some of these guidelines, well, that's up to them. They can just do that. On this council were every single agency of the federal government, pretty much, representatives of NGO organizations, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, the Audubon Society, groups like this that helped write Agenda 21 at the UN level, and representatives of global corporations. They all came together in this council for one specific purpose: to take the ideas, the voluntary suggestions of Agenda 21, and make them law of the land. So when this happened, this argument that, oh, it's just a suggestion, went out the window. And what they did, the NGOs that wrote Agenda 21 in the first place, wrote the grant programs for HUD, for EPA, Department of Transportation, and they put in those grants small print that said, you take this grant, you will have to do this and this and this, which was the implementation of Agenda 21.
Like a cancer, Agenda 21 started embedding itself into every cell of the federal government and on down to the state governments.
That was in 1993, and that directed every federal cabinet officer to have a program for the implementation of Agenda 21.
Between 1993 and 1999, as Americans slept, sustainable development concepts and laws infiltrated every county, township, and city as federal and state grants, more realistically bribes, flowed with abandon.
Sustainable development interjected itself into states and localities through the use of monetary bribes, to be quite blunt. If these localities wanted to obtain money for certain projects, they had to sign on to projects that had sustainable development aspects to them. Somebody's brother-in-law made money in putting in that extra layer of asphalt and paint and so forth and so on. And that was the reason it's there.
And how they've actually gotten it to our local cities is through these carrots, the stick and carrot of giving federal highway safety transportation funds, as an example, to implement areas of sustainable development.
And that is pursued through 4 presidents, to include Donald Trump, to today.
Then, in 2015, after the UN enumerated 8 major goals for sustainable development at the 2000 Millennium Summit, Agenda 21 was officially updated to Agenda 2030.
The 70th session of the General Assembly has opened with a towering achievement. The adoption of the 2030 Agenda, including 17 inspiring Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
Agenda 2030 now specifies 17 major goals for the world to reach by the year 2030. The long march through rural and suburban America continued.
And so, of course, this is a devastating thing to the United States and to other nations that value freedom and their individual rights, because this plan is completely antithetical to the concept of individual freedom.
Now, in 2019, we have the Green New Deal breaking out in the public domain for the first time, openly pushing the goals of both Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030.
When we have this threat that challenges all of us, the solution is going to take all of us too.
Everywhere you go across the United States, you find evidence of sustainable development. Even in this water here, it talks about sustainability.
So this is really, no matter how they describe it, it's a fundamental transfer of sovereign power to the United Nations from each of the member countries in the United Nations to be exercised through control over land and other natural resources.
Like the gay rights movement before it, Karl Marx and the socialist movement have now come out of the closet naked and charging. The United States is immersed in an action plan that may have started out with some good intentions, but now subjects we the people to the threat of a Marxist world order.
Climate change is the #1 reason for the implementation of Agenda 21.
The world's population has been growing exponentially because of the agricultural revolution and several industrial revolutions fueled by oil, coal, and natural gas.
You don't have to haul wood and go and chop trees and do all kinds of hard work, stuff that is really provided by science and technology.
But, per Malthus, humanity does not use industry-created abundances to improve standards of living. It uses abundances to increase the size of the population. This leads to poverty, starvation, resource depletion, and eventually a degradation or a destruction of the environment, something common to us all. But the biggest threat to the environment, according to the power elite and its apologists, is the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere due to the burning of fossil fuels. This CO2 buildup is causing the planet to warm, the greenhouse effect. If CO2 reaches a critical point, whereby it causes a condition of runaway warming, Earth could become like the planet Venus, complete with a 900-degree surface temperature and no life. Global warming would thus be an existential event as bad as global thermonuclear war. Given this, one has to admit the power elite has made a very good argument, if their facts are correct.
The sun and H2O, water, have a far, far greater effect on the climate of the planet and how hot the planet is than CO2 does.
This then brings up the argument of whether the warming from the sun is causing a CO2 buildup or whether CO2 buildup is causing the warming.
In the past, we have CO2 10 times, 20 times higher than what we have at the present time. One of the most well-known examples is to study the carbon dioxide content in the air bubble that is trapped in the ice core from Antarctica. When you study that record carefully, you find that it is always, I emphasize, that is always the temperature that is changing, rising or dropping first before the atmospheric carbon dioxide respond to it. When Al Gore, when they try to talk about this topic, they always wave their hand like this, left and right. More carbon dioxide, temperature warm. When less carbon dioxide, temperature cool. But they forgot to tell you this is basically wrong.
For every scientist who says global warming or CO2 buildup is bad, you can find one that says global warming and CO2 buildup are good. One scientist says that global warming is causing the polar caps to melt. Another says global warming is making the planet more fertile.
If we take the CO2 that was originally in the atmosphere and is now in the form of coal and oil and gas, and we burn that coal and oil and gas to generate electricity or to make steel or aluminum, then what happens is we release the CO2 that had become locked away in the rocks, and it goes back into the atmosphere. There, the trees and plants like it, and they are taking up more than half of all the CO2 that we emit and turning it into leaves and trunks. You can see it happening all around us. Trees and plants, if you're any kind of a gardener, growing more rapidly than ever because CO2 is plant food.
Yet another says sea levels are rising and flooding coastal cities. Another says a warmer planet means a longer growing season, hence the ability to grow more crops and remedy poverty.
If you study this very, very carefully and you ignore all the politics, that's what science is supposed to do, and you don't get your hand tied and your mouth completely controlled by the UN mouthpiece, then you will reach the conclusion that quite a substantial part is actually explained by natural component. The more sunlight you have, you will warm, you will evaporate more, and then you will evaporate water vapor. That causes the greenhouse effect. Water vapor is the primary greenhouse gas versus CO2, which is always known in any textbook as a secondary or tertiary greenhouse gas.
Some astronomers tell us global warming has nothing to do with human activity or fossil fuel-driven industrialization. The entire solar system is warming up due to fluctuations in the sun's coronal output.
Carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is a cycle that is driven almost entirely by our sun and has very little to do with human activity.
We have collected data from Mars, from Jupiter, from even out in Neptune. We have actually shown that the sun has melted the Mars ice cap. The sun is warming the whole solar system. And it so happened that Earth is one of the inhabitants of the solar system, period.
We don't see a lot of climate scientists and those talking about climate change and global warming mentioning the fact that there is a proportional increase in temperature on planets where there are no people.
A number of years back, we had climatologists tell us that the world was not warming. It was cooling due to the dimming effect of particulate matter in the atmosphere. With this discovery, the term global warming was converted into the term climate change. Talk about hedging your bets.
Look at the question of particulate matter in the atmosphere. What is the effect of that? How much of it? Where is it moving? What is it? What kind of things are it? Volcanoes. Volcanoes emit carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, sulfur trioxide, carbon monoxide. Think of all the elements and compounds that are emitted. What is that effect?
Whether or not climate change is an existential threat, the United Nations is marching forward and using it to justify the central planning of not only the land, air, and water, but all resources, plants, animals, and humans on the planet, as we discussed earlier.
The global elitists who are currently in power want people to believe that carbon dioxide in our atmosphere first is a tremendous problem, and secondly, they want us to believe that the cycle of the amount of carbon dioxide that happens to be in concentrations in our atmosphere is driven by human activity.
The real problem here is that there's a political driving force behind what they call climate change, which is once again the desire of the UN through their general sustainable development theories to gain increasing control over the way industrial society operates. Then you really have a kind of a stranglehold on every country in which the United Nations can exercise this kind of power.
And that is why most governments around the world, because all of them have their totalitarian streak, have gone along so gladly and so readily with the storyline that global warming is going to happen at a rate sufficient to cause danger, and only the government can save the environment from the people.
The solution is always more government control, more taxes, and less freedom for you.
In their words, they are doing this through a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations system, governments, and major groups in every area where humanity impacts the environment. By organizations of the UN, we mean the World Trade Organization, the World Court, the World Bank, and non-government organizations like the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, and Wildlands Network.
NGO, or non-governmental organization, is actually an official position in the United Nations. They apply for that privilege to be part of that. Once they are accepted as an official NGO, then they're able to participate behind the scenes in these numerous UN meetings and help write documents. And in their minds, these NGO organizations are our representatives in the UN. So they're looking at a global governance, and the people's voice are the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, and Planned Parenthood, and others. In their mind, that's how they look at it.
By governments of the UN, we mean the UN's 193 member states, as well as ICLEI, also known as Local Governments for Sustainability.
ICLEI, the International Council on Local Environmental Initiatives, is an international group. It calls itself Local Governments for Sustainability, but it's really not a local group at all. It is an international group. It's made up of thousands of cities, and we're talking about huge cities. We're talking about San Francisco, London, Tokyo, New York, Rome, the largest cities in the world, as well as many, many smaller cities. In the United States, over 1,000 cities are members.
ICLEI is basically a full-service organization for sustainable development. It's a network of 1,500-plus cities, towns, and regions in over 124 countries, headquartered in Bonn, Germany. Effectively, ICLEI is a UN-spawned foreign government operating in the U.S. across jurisdictional boundaries.
It's a foreign organization based in Bonn, Germany, that has infiltrated not just America, but countries all over the world for the purpose of implementing Agenda 21.
ICLEI, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiative, founded in 1990 at the UN, is a government entity. It is made up of governments, and states are forbidden by Article 1, Section 10 to form alliances or confederations with foreign entities. They can't make treaties, for example. And so any town or any city or county that belongs to ICLEI is a violation of Article 1, Section 10.
Well, Article 1, Section 10 says that states may not engage in treaties with foreign governments. The only treaty power is in Article 2 of the Constitution. The President negotiates treaties, and then the Senate advises and consents on their ratification. The fact that ICLEI is registered in Bonn, Germany, immediately raises the question of an international operation that's going on here. The very fact that it's located overseas should point up that we have a problem with these activities being adopted by states and localities, because the Constitution of the United States prohibits, if you will, any state from entering into a treaty with a foreign government or a foreign entity of some kind. So really this is kind of an end run that's being done by the United Nations through ICLEI essentially to camouflage what's really going on here. And it's simply amazing that more people in this country don't raise that question.
And the question becomes, under Article 1, Section 10, can such a party engage in domestic activities? And the answer to that is no. And they're bringing in international organizations in order to advance that interest. And I say to that, if you're sitting on the city council, you have an obligation under the Constitution, and then it must cease. If you don't do that, you become duplicitous.
If you know or believe that someone is committing a felony, you are required to report that to some official. might be a judge or someone else, and if you fail to do that, then you are guilty of the crime of misprision. All right? You have a duty as a citizen to report criminal activity. Well, here we have what looks like a very large-scale operation going on internationally to subvert governments of states and localities, and ultimately through them the government of the United States, on behalf of the United Nations, various foreign powers within the United Nations, the people behind the United Nations, anyway, international concert of action. And one would think that people in those localities would be able to say, wait a minute, we think what's going on here is felonious conduct. They're in violation of various state or national statutes, and we want to take this to the appropriate official under our misprision statute. That might be a judge, it might be a local prosecutor, whatever. We need to do that. And then when those people are confronted with that charge, they are supposed to take action. But as far as I know, no action of that kind has ever been taken.
The UN has established or inspired global and foreign networks, organizations, groups, and governments to infiltrate the U.S. at every level and effectuate the principles of sustainable development, with or without the American public's knowledge or consent. Unsustainable.
We're not being told about these plans, and yet it impacts even our breath as I share this with you. And so, you know, I'm super excited about this Green New Deal thing, because finally people are seeing, wait a minute, there is an agenda going on, and what is this thing all about?
So what you're seeing though with ICLEI and with your metropolitan planning organizations and your councils of government that are literally all over the United States, what you're seeing is regionalization in action. This is how it's implemented through this organization, which is looking for ways to restrict your ability to use your natural resources and to have you rezone and re-general plan the center of your town so that it can only be used for very high density development. This is the purpose of organizations like this, to regionalize as an interim step to full globalization.
Instead of the human civilization expanding and boldly going into an infinite universe of real estate and energy, we are supposed to shrivel up on a planet under the UN's precautionary principle, a principle that considers all human activity and advancement dangerous unless proven not dangerous.
You can't move forward unless you can prove there's no harm. And so it demands that the government step in and say, well, there might be long-toed salamanders on this land. There might be. So you can't do anything till you can prove that there isn't. And of course, you can't prove the negative. You can't prove there are no long-toed salamanders. So the edict is, and it's used very conveniently for whatever excuse they may want to use it for, to simply stop people from using their property.
Under these new environmental laws ushered in by ICLEI and other foreign agents of the UN, all manner of federal grants were and still are being given to states, counties, townships, and cities in order to literally bribe officials into implementing Agenda 21 and its battle cry of sustainable development.
Whenever a higher level of government makes a grant and it looks like a bribe, is because it is a bribe. It's also a threat. It's a means of acquiring addiction on the part of those receiving the grant. Once you get a person or a state at any level addicted to this easy money that's coming in from up above, they get to the point where they forget how to live on their own means, their own income, their own tax base, or whatever it is. And they're totally now dependent on the source of the money. So without anybody voting for it, without any change in the laws, without any revision in the Constitution, all of a sudden, whatever separation of power there was disappears. And it's the old saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Most of the U.S. population is not aware of any of this, especially Agenda 21. They are only aware that suddenly there is some new zoning law that inhibits their ability to get a building permit, requires them to pay 20% of their renovation budget for a wheelchair ramp or an elevator for the handicapped, or suddenly the stream across their street must be remediated and the state will be sending down a grant of $130,000 for the local officials to allocate as they see fit.
Every single issue that we face, whether in your community when they're doing the comprehensive plans, if you have a program to put in bike paths, if you have a program to control how buildings are constructed, and they always tell you it's local, local, local. One of the biggest problems we have is the use of facilitated meetings. Facilitated meetings are run by a professional facilitator who is trained in psychology, and he is trained, here is where this meeting's going to go. This is the outcome we're going to have. And he knows how to lead that meeting to exactly that outcome. But then they say, oh, the community decided this.
They actually create the plans for visioning meetings that direct how it is that your government is going to change the center of your town to the smart growth or new urbanism model, so that it'll be higher and denser. It's what I call vertical sprawl. And of course, they do your climate action plans where they're monitoring, metering, and controlling what it is that your emissions are. In order to manage your emissions, then they have to monitor them regularly and continuously. So this is the way this plan is designed. It's designed as a continuous loop for monitoring, metering, and managing the entire energy output and use of the world.
Before now, have you even heard of ICLEI? What about COGS, MPOs, or the ADA? How about human settlements or the Biodiversity Treaty? You are not alone. Few have any idea how the cancers of regulation have invaded the land of the free.
And when Agenda 21 not only uses our government as a tool contrary to our rights, but brings in foreign law and foreign influence to dictate upon the people and their states unlawful exercise of power, we are operating completely contrary to our established America. We're operating completely contrary to the rights of the people, and we will be destructive of our own future.
The Biodiversity Treaty was unleashed at the Earth Summit along with Agenda 21 in 1992. This treaty is considered key to sustainable development, and it sets forth the following rationale. The human race cannot sustain itself if it is polluting the water, air, and land of the planet due to overpopulation-induced CO2 buildup and fossil fuel-driven industrialization. Since the biosphere of Earth depends on an intricate and interdependent hierarchy of species, it does not make sense to antagonize or destroy the environment. This is reasonable, but what is not reasonable is extreme environmentalism.
This is the Biodiversity Treaty. It is 1,147 pages thickness of what is and is not sustainable in the 21st century. It talks about unsustainable things that human beings do. For example, power lines, ponds, fences, paddocks, religion. It talks about the unsustainability of the future because of population. It talks about golf courses, scuba diving, all these wonderful sports and skiing and all these things that we do as human beings. It's all unsustainable.
The Biodiversity Treaty was originally the brainchild of a radical environmentalist named Dave Foreman. He was the head of an organization called Earth First. He put together what was called the Wildlands Project. The Wildlands Project called for rewilding, their term, 50% of all the land in every state, back to the way it was before Christopher Columbus. Foreman's goal was to reduce the population to about 250 million people, and one of those dreams was to have the the gray wolf and the grizzly have an unbroken line from Chihuahua, Mexico to Canada.
The Wildlands Project is one of those things that just sounds so crazy you can't believe that it could possibly be true. And it's the idea, which seems like a good one, that human beings should be restricted to specific locations and animals should be free to move freely through the world. And so because of that, then you have designs that require corridors, which are animal corridors, core areas for animals, and buffer zones. And these surround the islands of human habitation.
Under the Wildlands Project, vast tracts of land throughout the United States will be returned to the wild. Few or no humans will be permitted on tracts of land that could span the nation from Los Angeles to New York, Canada to Mexico. Humans can visit, but they cannot stay.
Take rural lands and put it off limits to human beings. We see that beginning to happen right now. Roads are being closed. Forests are being more limited. And the idea here is that you stack and pack people in metropolitan areas, you put them on public transportation, and you never let them outside.
Human beings are irresponsible. We are planetary villains, and therefore we need to create this Wildlands Project, a network of cores and corridors that are given, where the animals, the species, the plants are given priority over human beings.
And this is the goal: islands of human habitation, or human settlements, or transit villages that concentrate human beings into specific locations so that animals can be free to move freely throughout the world.
All human development and support services, including roads, power lines, dams, farms, ranches, police and firefighting services, will be gone. Only wolves, suckerfish, spotted owls, and indigenous species will remain.
Extreme environmentalism is what we're seeing coming out of our colleges and universities right now. So the Biodiversity Treaty attempts to, in many cases, it will regulate to one species to the complete detriment of all others.
South San Jose is a good example of what's become, or is becoming, a wildlands project. South San Jose is called the Coyote Valley. And gee, some coyotes like to cross that valley, and some other animals as well. And so that's off limits to development. And we're seeing that kind of activity happening everywhere across this country.
But where will the humans go? Not to worry. Agenda 21 and its spawns have a plan. Recall we mentioned the United Nations Habitat 1 plan that came down at the Vancouver Convention in 1976. Under this plan, all humans that once lived on farms and in rural areas, so-called wildlands, will be relocated to cities, now referred to as human settlements.
And the idea is that if you concentrate populations into specific areas or zones, less energy usage, less water usage, and less transportation. So people will have less reason to leave home. They'll stay in their homes. They may even work out of their homes. And so they're not going to be using their cars, they're not going to be using energy, and they're not going to be using water.
Since, as we saw earlier, the UN is not big on property rights, it should come as no surprise that the first private property to be phased out will be single-family homes, what socialists at UN headquarters consider suburban sprawl. Instead, we the people will live in apartments and condos in megacities near railroad tracks. Our super tall dwelling units will all be built to UN-specified building codes authorized by ICLEI, COGS, the ADA, and a myriad of NGOs and other friends of sustainable development. While the animals run wild in continental corridors, we the humans will live in transit villages and smart cities.
Smart growth, or new urbanism, is that ideology that says that you shouldn't have more space than you actually need. So if you're a couple of people living in a 3-bedroom house, well, You don't need that extra space, so why do you have it?
There's a clear, concerted effort to make it really just about as miserable as possible to exist and use your own private transportation, own your own home. All impetus and incentive, in financial and otherwise, is to convince people that it is unsustainable to live in your own home, have air conditioning. It is their duty as a human being, as a global citizen, you see. You basically exist and little more.
Our high-rise, stack and pack dwelling units, complete with smart meters and smart heating systems, will make sure no one uses too much energy. And if they do, the energy police, with help from the neighbors and eye-on-the-street surveillance systems, will be right there to handle the situation.
If they can put 1,000 people in one building, it's a whole lot easier to know what they're doing, where they're going, and how they're thinking than it is if you got 1,000 people living in a rural or suburban area. And so the stack and pack is multi-story buildings, multiple families living in the same spot, walking in and out of the same door, always being able to be managed. And smart meters play a big role in that management, as they can measure everything that you do in your life when you're using smart appliances.
If you have a garden or a single-family residence, while you're watering your garden, you maybe have more than one bathroom, you're taking too many showers, you're using more than your 10 gallons of water a day. And this is unsustainable. So you need to be removed from your single-family residence.
Anybody that's got a couple of acres of land and his own water supply and can grow his own food, these people are a threat to the collectivist society, because they aren't going to go to the politicians and say, please feed me, please clothe me, please give me shelter. That's the secret behind Agenda 21. They want people out of the country. They want corporations out there growing all the food and that kind of thing, but they don't want anybody living out there.
To describe human settlements and the food sheds that sustain them as modern-day concentration camps might be a little over the top, because with no cars, parking lots, or air travel, everyone will walk and use bikes, so they will be fit and healthy. At least as healthy as the genetically modified foods they are forced to eat will allow.
These islands of human habitation are surrounded by, of course, the continental corridors that wild carnivores can use to repopulate the continent, and all continents, in fact. So human beings aren't going to really want to be going out there into the wildlands area. And they're, of course, if you're a locavore, which you should be, under this plan, then you're not going to be getting your food from more than 25 miles away. And so that means that your transit village or your island of human habitation needs to be ringed by a food shed. And the food sheds, or of course you can grow your food hydroponically in a sort of a multi-story concrete parking garage kind of thing that you get your food in. But your food sheds are those rings of land that are around these islands of human habitation. And they have a limited amount of calories that they can produce. And if you're limiting the numbers, then you have to ask yourself, well, who gets to live there? And let's say you want to get married or have a baby. Do you have to wait for someone to leave or die?
In a universe of infinite energy, where the sun burns 4 million tons of hydrogen every second, and a gallon of seawater can be fused to provide the energy density of 300 gallons of gasoline, no good citizen would even think about using or wasting energy when sustainable development came to their neighborhood.
So it really is, how do you control where people live, and how do you get people living in these highly dense areas? Because according to United Nations Agenda 21 and these power elites, you and I need to be living where we can save planet Earth by living in a high dense community. And it's happening all over the United States.
But getting all the humans off the rural lands will not be easy. The UN's cohort of governments, NGOs, and COGs, including the U.S. government and hundreds of ICLEI-supported local governments, will have to do a lot of land confiscation. Not an easy task unless they're able to disarm the U.S. population first. Luckily, a police state, especially a global police state, has many platforms and tools that cut across jurisdictional boundaries, as an ICLEI website proudly states.
In order to control mankind, we have to get them all into the big cities. We have to rack them up and stack them up, get them dependent on the state for their food, their shelter, their electrical power, their water, everything. That's the dirty secret behind Agenda 21.
We all know about takings like eminent domain, where the government wants to put a highway through your living room. But sustainable development Nazis and their friendly word-processing lawyers have come up with some interesting new ways to take your private property. One way is to create conservation easements and historic trusts.
Conservation easement and historic trust are two ways of imposing limited controls on private property. Conservation easement, like any other easement, says that there are certain kinds of uses that can or cannot be applied by the property owner in order to do what? In order to advance somebody's theory of conservation.
Most people, when they hear the term conservation easement, it sounds like a good thing. Well, we'll offset. We won't use this piece of property for, the Rocky Mountain elk or whatever, or some salamander. So you're blocked off. If you join this easement, you're given money, an exchange of money, to say, I will not use this land for 90 years. But then when you die, the easement goes on, and people beyond you cannot use that property to how they feel and want to use that property.
And the experience that most people who have had in regards to this endeavor is that after 10 years, the terms of that conservation easement make the land worthless, or actually a cost to them. And so it's a process of beating the landowners down until lands are simply surrendered. Once you've given into a conservation easement, you're finished.
These entities are proliferating across the land as hundreds of thousands of helpless citizens who have been raped and pillaged now realize.
Conservation easements are used to promise farmers that if they sign a conservation easement, their land will be a farm forever. And I've never met a farmer yet who wanted to leave the farm. They want to leave it to their kids. They want to move on forward with it. And so they look at this, and they're under all kinds of pressure about what to do with their farms. So now they've come up with this plan to ease the pain of the farmers by signing a conservation easement. But they do it, it's signed in perpetuity, forever. And what the farmers begin to find out is, after a few years, all of a sudden they have nothing left to leave to their kids. They now have all kinds of regulations from the land trust they signed with about how they can grow crops, sustainable crop growth and that sort of thing. They can't survive because it doesn't work, and there's no way out of it.
The idea is this: any area, landmass, or territory a UN government or NGO wants to rezone as a California-type wildland or an historic mill in a place like Chester Springs, Pennsylvania, simply gets a circle drawn around it on the map. Then, Agenda 21 Nazis from some historic trust in Washington, D.C., or some ICLEI-sponsored COG offers farmers and owners of historic property bribe money if they will just put their property into an irrevocable trust and sign away the development rights for a good cause.
That particular piece of property usually that comes up with buildings, structures of one kind or another. And so you're limited in making any kinds of changes there. So that freezes that particular property in a historic epoch.
Conservatives believe, in their country. We love our history, we love our heritage, and anytime we have a chance to preserve it, then that's what we want to do. Well, they've come up with this sucker move called National Heritage Areas. National Heritage Areas are promoted to protect something historic that happened there. Fact of the matter is, I haven't been in one yet that wasn't preserved already through, a presidential residence, something like that. And it's the same environmental groups and same NGO organizations that are behind this.
The farmer or property owner, needing money because the water and roads sustaining his land have been shut down by the Wildlands Project, agrees to an easement filed against his property.
Property is taken for an easement. They only take a small strip of the property to be used, perhaps to put in a gas pipeline or something, a public utility. But it all comes down to a beneficial use of the property by the property owner is removed from his control.
Little by little, through a complicated dance of legal shenanigans and outright deceit, the trust eventually gains control over the farm, the rural land, or some historic Chester Springs property. The original farmer or victimized historic property owner is then kicked off his land or out of his house when some infraction of the trust covenant, such as improper windows, is discovered.
This particular piece of property, for one reason or another, or structure built on the property, has some kind of historic value, and you cannot change in any way that particular piece of property. Usually that comes up with buildings, structures of one kind or another. And so you're limited in making any kinds of changes there.
The animals and the Agenda 21 Nazis are now free to roam into yet more wildlands and historic properties.
I spent my entire career as a government appraiser, an appraiser of industrial, commercial, and residential property. And what I found in the year 2002 was that there was a revolution, a planning revolution going on. And it literally made it impossible to tell what property was worth or what you could do with it. Because even though it might be zoned for a use, you were not able to actually use it for that purpose.
There's no rhyme or reason. The whole law in this area is what I call reflexive law. That is, the law just reflects what they want to do. And so endangered species is now interpreted, along with a precautionary principle, to allow local governments to do or say anything about a land use.
So you might be zoned one way, but if your general plan says that you have to develop smart growth, well, you can't use it in the way that you thought you could, and you may end up having to sell your property to a developer, a favored developer, who's getting grants.
Permit discretion is another tool used by local governments. If they like you, you might get a permit. If they don't like you, you won't get a permit. And that kind of abuse isn't as recognized as it ought to be. It clearly exists. Those who've been victims of it know it exists. And those people need to speak out more because, without work by the early victims of Agenda 21, we all will ultimately become victims of Agenda 21.
But if conservation easements and historic trusts don't work, sustainable developers have devised other schemes to take property.
If you're out in the rural and suburban areas, you might be thinking, well, nobody's going to get me off my property. I'm here and I like it and I'm just going to keep living here. And sure, that seems great. But just think about this. Your roads won't be paved because your county has no more money. And so they're going to pulverize your roads and turn them to gravel. Or you're going to have your well monitored and you're being restricted on the use. You might actually not be able to afford your insurance anymore, or you might have your insurance canceled because you're in an area that's a fire area. You might find that you're not able to continue to pay the taxes for the sheriff and for the hospital and for all the other services that you have out there in the county because other people have been removed from their land through restrictions on their use or through fire or other situations that have occurred and make it so that very few people are out there and they're carrying the entire tax burden. So then you're finding that you're not able to actually maintain the land that you're on, and you'll find that you're moved off of your land and moved into the city.
How does it help the Wildlands Project? It sets up more of those priority development areas that are then going to be connected by a corridor. And then you have this whole network across the United States that is now going back to that Wildlands Project map.
2006, 5 black robes decided that if a community can better use the land, then it's okay to take it, use eminent domain and take it. As soon as that decision was made, across the country, thousands of decisions using eminent domain were made. You know, why? Why would they ignore every precedent that was ever done in every court case in the Supreme Court about private property, and every line ever written by our founding fathers about private property? Why would they eliminate that? The truth of the matter is, they had to do it in order to implement sustainable development. And in that day, private property in America died.
America is under siege. The globalists bought off the corporate media. They are literally enemies of the people. They know what they're doing. And they are selectively deciding what they want to burn down and what they want to destroy and what they want to take over.
You'll see in fire areas that lands are, more and more land is owned by the federal government, the state government, and the county governments. And they're not clearing out the undergrowth. They're not maintaining the forests. And so they're more susceptible to fire danger. And the fires are larger and are moving more quickly because the undergrowth is not being removed. So people out in rural areas might find that they're restricted in whether they can return to their properties or not.
You burn out the areas you want first, outside Austin, they're going to be the most valuable later. You burn out all the poor areas, you burn them to the ground with forced gentrification, and then you come in behind it. Look at the overlaid map of the UN Agenda 21, where they would not allow fire breaks and rewilding, and match where the fires are.
Before America was America, there were Native Americans that roamed this nation from one end to the other, and they culled and they used the resources in these forests. Government has now created a situation where they say the best, most environmentally friendly thing that we can do is to keep humans out of these areas. So as they restrict many hundreds of acres from forestry management of any kind, hunting, recreation, even housing, we're creating a disaster. These forests are filled with fuel, and let's face it, one lightning strike and these things go up and it burns. The fire does not know boundaries. It burns off from the parks. It burns through neighborhoods, people's homes, their businesses, and schools. And it's only then when they go into their town hall and ask, or better yet, beg them for a permit to rebuild, and they're told there's no more single-family homes in their area, it's only then that the light goes on.
Here's President Trump. He is deplaning from Air Force One. He's at Beale Air Force Base in California. He's there to survey fire damage from the raging wildfires. So far, they've killed 75 people, Leland.
But when President Trump blamed the fires on poor forest management, apologists of sustainable development pilloried him, stating that forest fires are being caused by global warming, not 30 years of Agenda 21-inspired restrictions on timber harvesting, fire breaks, prescribed burning, and tree clearing.
We've been barred by Democrat policies from building what's called fire breaks and controlled burns. And the president points this out, and the controlled media goes, he's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And they cut to a clip of him saying they need to cut the brush out. They need to cut the weeds out. They need to create lanes so the fire doesn't jump over. And they go, man, he's really crazy. No one's ever heard of that. He's making it up.
The forest fire, especially in the U.S. context, is absolutely has nothing to do with climate change. It's mostly caused by the government poor management of all these wildland areas, not allowing trees to be cut down so you serve as a fuel for fire. Any amount of dryness, this is clearly a management issue that is poorly managed. And I would say that if you want to find blames, I mean, the government is the one to be blamed.
Preeminent conspiracy researchers claim that recent wildfires in California, such as the 2017 Tubbs Fire, and the 2018 Campfire in Paradise were started or intensified with concentrated energy weapons.
What we see in these fires is entirely a different pattern. We are seeing the plant life act as the resistance to the fire, and we are seeing things that would ordinarily resist fire burn down to white ash. It is actually very similar to some of the patterns that we saw on 9/11/2001. And it would not be out of the realm of the imagination to think that this may be what is referred to as scalar interferometry weaponry.
A haunting but mesmerizing scene from the wildfires in Sonoma County. A man came across this tree burning from the inside out. The tree appears to be hollowed out by embers and flames.
I highly recommend the work of Thomas Bearden. People who are familiar with the work of Nikola Tesla should look into what Tesla did with scalar waves. And I think it's very possible that these types of directed energy weapons or concentrated energy weapons not only have been actively developed by covert factions of our military-industrial complex, but it's very possible that we may have already seen them deployed and used in test circumstances.
If Americans don't wake up, Agenda 21 and its most recent spawn, the Green New Deal, will destroy not only our natural resources, but our entire constitutional republic.
Well, the Green New Deal is a fascist plan for environmental policies to control all human action. Now, most people wouldn't think that some socialist congresswoman in New York could be labeled a fascist. But there's nothing new in the Green New Deal that Adolf Hitler was not doing with respect to his green movement in the German hills.
The Green New Deal is not, they say it's all about being fair and equitable and blah, blah, blah. But let me ask you, who's on, pictured on glue? Elmer. The clue is in the glue. All these wonderful byproducts that come to us by cattle. Carbon. My teeth are carbon. And they want to tax carbon under this Green New Deal. And they also want to get rid of fossil fuel. And you know what? For all those who are saying, you know what? Keep it in the ground. Keep it in the ground. That is their saying when it comes to fossil fuel and putting it back in the ground. Somebody's pacemaker that keeps them alive right now is made of plastic, which is made from fossil fuel. I guarantee we will get portions of the Green New Deal because our Congress, our House, our Senate, they're not standing up to this. They're wimping out, and it's frustrating. It's so frustrating.
It will eliminate private property and especially real estate ownership. It will destroy locally elected representative government. Free markets and individual freedom will all be gone. Most decisions will be made by agents of a global government hell-bent on protecting the environment in the name of equality and sustainable development. In short, the policies of the UN's radical agendas will increase worldwide poverty, decrease educational standards, increase world population, and decrease national and global security. The United Nations is not ushering some new world order as advertised. It is reinstating the old world order, an order where the rights come from the state, not the deity, an order where unarmed citizens are helpless, hapless, and hopeless as their governments rape and pillage them with excessive taxes, steal their private property, and mass murder them in the name of national security. An order of top-down governments commanded by dictators, sultans, and oligarchs, kings, queens.
The greatest thing that our founders did when they created our constitutional republic was to say, you know what? Let's stop being a kingdom. Because we've noticed that no matter how much you limit a king, when you call somebody a king, at the end of the day, he's going to act like one, and people will always act like subjects. Let's be a constitutional republic. We created the new standard for liberty, the expanded rights of the people. would be something that would spread throughout the world. What's interesting is, as we forget history, we steer ourselves towards the exact same thing our founders tried to keep us from. We have created an oligarchy in the judiciary by talking about how the Supreme Court issues rulings and makes law. We have created an oligarchy in Congress where we've established that the people believe that Congress can issue any law that they can pass by a majority. We've nearly created a kingdom with the enormous amount of power that has been transferred to the office of the executive.
I think that if the people in this country were to recognize the necessity of getting back to the founders' plan, if they were to do that, that would throw a massive monkey wrench into the plans of the globalist oligarchy, because they want disarmed populations that are easy to control, and they want solidification of power. The more power is solidified, once again, easier for them to control, and they have a few people to control at the top rather than the entire population. The last thing they want is that for the power of the purse and the sword, of money or military power to be diffused among the people. That's why they don't want sound money, that's why they don't want a militia.
Yes, the New World Order proposed by the UN power elite is nothing less than global totalitarianism.
The idea of total control from the top down, the elites, the royalty, the monarchs, with the peasants and serfs at the bottom serving their masters above. This is as old as the hills. But the new part is, in the old days, they used to administer their power and their control over the people at the point of a sword, with weapons and military power. Today, they're doing it with control of the mind and economic power. So in that sense, it's new. It's the old relationship, but being brought about with new weapons. The weapons of mind control and economic power.
To this, you may say hogwash. This movie is presenting nothing more than conspiracy theories. Time will tell. But consider this. Consider the mechanics of establishing a world government and review what is actually happening.
I think to answer that question, we just need to open up our daily newspapers and see how it's developing. Because we already have world government. It's not fully developed, but it's greatly developed. We see right now that the so-called leaders of all the nations get together quite regularly at international conferences and meetings, and they share ideas and they come up with plans and strategies. And all the nations seem to go along in lockstep. The philosophy in all of the nations of the world today, I can't think of any exception, is collectivism. It's hard to find much differences between countries anymore, except in the degree to which they have gone toward collectivism. Every day that goes by, there's more government power, more taxes, more internationalization of that power, and fewer personal liberties.
By definition, a world government is a superstate. Instead of having 195 independent countries, as we now have, a world government would be one country run by one centrally planned global government. What F.A. Hayek warned us about in The Road to Serfdom.
The United Nations is an attempt to create an umbrella organization with all of the nations still existing as nations, although some of their authority has been siphoned off by the United Nations. So the United Nations has not quite reached that goal. I'm sure that that's the ultimate goal of the people behind it, is the nation states will disappear. They will simply become districts or appendages of the United Nations as the single world government. So you will have essentially one nation as we now understand it, which has one government and control over territory, but that government will control the entire territory of the entire world.
A world government, if such a monstrosity were ever to come about, would look very like the government of communist China, very like the government of communist Russia. All the institutions of world government, the United Nations itself, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Law of the Sea Conference, there are dozens of them now, the International Labour Organization, I could go on listing them forever. Not a single one has its governing board elected by the peoples of the member states of the United Nations who created that body. The essential pre-qualification for any such thing is that that government should be elected by the members of all the states parties to the treaty creating that particular entity. And you can imagine how unpopular it would be in places like communist China if they were made to conduct elections for a world government, when the people would say, well, why can't we have elections for the government in China? And it is precisely for that reason that no world governing entity, the ones I've mentioned, is elected, because the communists won't stand for it.
The criterion for consolidation would be mineral resources, land, water, air, cultures, languages, ethnicities, or even by local government jurisdictions. This is already happening with COGs, also known as Councils of Government.
World government has always proven itself to be the worst of the worst in terms of political systems. All of the global powers of history have been antithetical to the principles of freedom and liberty. They rule by brute force. They do not recognize the rights under God of the individual. They believe the state to be supreme. They believe the state to be in the place of God, literally. We are more free when we are more sovereign as a nation. The more we acquiesce to those global institutions, the more freedoms we lose, the more of our constitutional form of government we lose. And so the best thing that the American people can do is totally reject America's involvement with any of these global institutions.
The Great Seal of the United States, which was put together in the 1780s, contains the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is New World Order. The history of our country was very, very shaky at the beginning, and thanks to George Washington, we survived the impact of that, but they haven't gone away. They're still working at it, and we have to be on guard.
No matter what the criterion for global government's consolidation, what's known as regionalization, it would mean the end of borders, hence the end of national sovereignties.
Regionalization is this means of taking over whole areas of county commissions and so forth, getting multiple communities, multiple counties into this, under a same umbrella. And what it does is it changes our system of government. Non-elected, appointed people are making decisions, and they have literally usurped the power of local elected communities. You elect, say, a city council that you want to run your community this way, but oh no, you're in this whole collection of counties. They've applied for the grants. They have are making the rules, and so you can't make that decision. So that means it doesn't matter who you elect. They're in charge, and they're going to do what they want to do.
Regionalism is where they take, for example, in the Bay Area, the One Bay Area Plan or Plan 2040, 101 cities and 9 counties, and put them under a comprehensive smart growth plan. The power of we, the people in the United States, is that we have a voting system where we get to say, wait a minute, you representative, you're not representing me anymore, I'm voting you out. If you're in a small town and you're now part of a larger town and that's part of a larger region, your vote, your power as we the people disappears.
The radical left is already calling for this as it champions the millions of immigrants that have entered the U.S. illegally. This is happening now on the U.S.-Mexican border. And if the UN's agenda is fully implemented, you can bet the U.S.-Mexican border will no longer exist and mass migrations will be the order of the day.
So, without foreigners getting inside in a country, it's really a problem for the country. I'm talking about intellectuals also, but also people who are going to work in our farm, people we're talking about people from Latin America coming here illegally, going back, bringing the money back, but they're doing a lot of work what Americans don't want to do it. Long if they're not criminals, if they want to work. Yeah, wonderful. I think there have to be solution for people what want to come in this country, work certain amount of the time, go back. They don't have to be punished for that. Kick out all criminals. Work out on education for all people here, and people what coming out here to be educated. It doesn't matter if they're legal or legal.
If the UN's agenda is fully implemented, you can bet the U.S.-Mexican border will no longer exist and mass migrations will be the order of the day.
In order to have a new world order, as they like to call it, which is, all pretty much the same, all nations the same, and all rules and regulations with the same concepts of what is right and what's wrong, the same judicial system and all of that sort of thing the same, you have to eliminate the differences. Of course, that's axiomatic. So up until fairly recently, there have been substantial differences between nations based on culture primarily. Well, it's necessary to get rid of those differences if you're going to really build a new world order. What better way than mingle the populations, bring mass migration from one area, put it into another area, and dilute the whole thing. It's like a big stirring pot. So that, in my view, is pretty much what the motivation is behind this mass migration movement, is to dilute and to literally destroy any firmly identified cultural differences so that what is left will be easily malleable into a unified, so-called one world state. Now that leads to a condition where there's so much chaos, and the average person is so frightened by it that they will be grateful for martial law. This is the end game, in my view, of what's going on with this mingling, quick mingling of conflicting cultures, is to bring about chaos at such a level that it'll seem justified, and thank goodness you did that, government, to bring in martial law to quell the violence. Of course, once the martial law is established, it will never go away.
At least when there's an evil dictator, that human is going to die. But for an AI, there would be no death. It would live forever. And then you'd have an immortal dictator from which we can never escape.
Why do you think the globalists, embedded in the Democratic and Republican parties, as well as the deep state and the mainstream media, are fighting over the wall Trump wants to build? The wall represents a barrier to mass migration, and mass migrations are part of the regionalization one would find prior to the establishment of a global government.
Regionalism in America is primarily focused upon the implementation of the COG agenda, the Council of Government agenda. Again, councils of government are everywhere. The Bay Area has the most advanced council of government in the nation. It is the elimination of the election of local government. That is what dissolves the American Republic. And when you were in grammar school, at least in my era, we learned the most important facet of American government isn't what DC does. It isn't even what Sacramento does. It's what happens in your local community. And today, regionalism has been engulfed with this concept of councils of government, which puts local government into a position where it's implementing, without electoral accountability, globalist plans for ultimate inculcation into world government.
Regionalization is an interim step to full globalization. And so it empowers the city-state or the mega-region. And most people are completely unaware of the mega-regions. There are 50 states in the United States, but there are 11 mega-regions. Specific locales that are huge cities are actually joined together. So you might have the Northern California megaregion, which is goes from Northern California, extends into Nevada and into Washington, and then the Northern Washington megaregion actually goes into Canada. The Southern California megaregion extends into Mexico. So you're breaking jurisdictional boundaries. It's not the entire states that we're talking about. These are portions of states and portions of countries. You actually break the jurisdictional boundaries. So you can destroy the ability of individuals to have representative government.
Again, this is all happening now. The writing is on the wall. Look at NAFTA, short for North American Free Trade Agreement, a regional trade law. This already happened. NAFTA was signed into law by Bill Clinton, the same rogue that signed Executive Order 12852 to unleash Agenda 21 across all federal agencies. NAFTA was a trade bill designed to bleed the U.S. dry in the name of social equity, one of the 3 E's of sustainable development discussed earlier.
Social equity will not only fundamentally transform the United States of America, but all countries. It's about being fair and equal according to the United Nations and Agenda 21. Fair and equal. Okay, so does that mean that I can't sing? I'm a terrible singer. But other people can make lots of money off of their ability to sing. So under this, what is my payment under Agenda 21 and social equity? Since I can't make money from my voice because it's terrible, how is the government or the governments, how are they going to repay me?
Under UN Agenda 21's NAFTA scheme, the United States has been deindustrialized, its middle class almost destroyed. The fact that this has happened under the watch of not only the UN's World Trade Organization, but the Democratic and Republican parties is proof that the governing elites in these entities are attempting to sabotage the United States. Many would call this treason. The mechanics of establishing a world government are happening all around us. Is this hogwash?
We can see this in our daily lives. We are seeing high-rise buildings housing more and more people concentrated into cities and being drawn out of rural areas. We are seeing cameras pop up on every street corner. There are literally millions of cameras watching our every move. Smart meters, which are being installed on our homes every day, are measuring our energy use. And by that, the power companies can understand what we're doing. If we're using our hairdryer, the amount of energy we're using is showing up in their monitors. These are just 3 examples of how the implementation of the one world government is already happening.
What we the people must do to stop Agenda 21 is, first of all, be educated about this thing. Number 2, do not be silent about it. Let the people know what we are facing in regard to our country.
Since its founding in 1945, the United Nations has adopted a number of missions leading up to the rationale for Agenda 21 and its twin ugly sisters, Agenda 2030 and the Green New Deal. These missions could be boiled down to prevent war, remedy poverty, reduce population, protect the environment, stop global warming, stop the climate from changing. Some would agree with some of these missions, but what many disagree with is the means by which the UN proposes solutions.
What they really want to happen is a chance to implement the Marxist mechanism. Because in the name of doing all of these good things, now we can redistribute the wealth, we can take away personal liberties, we can do all of these things, and that's really what their goal is. But they'll never say, well, my goal is to take away your personal rights and force you into a high-rise, or you have to depend on me for your clothing and your job and your health care. That's what I want. That wouldn't go over too well. That's it. What I want is, I want peace and prosperity and equality and brotherhood. These are propaganda statements, so that you will trust them, you will give them the power they want, you will pay the taxes they demand, and when you're all done, you will be in shackles.
We have seen that the UN's Declaration of Human Rights makes no mention of key human rights: petition, unreasonable searches, probable cause, speedy trial, trial by jury, due process, excessive bail, or even a free state. But most alarming is the fact that nowhere in the UN Declaration are the words keep and bear arms, militia, or private property, as used to refer to real estate. What kind of an organization fails to mention private property rights and self-defense? Now's the time to ask yourself that question.
The most essential principles of natural rights are your inalienable right to secure your own life, your own liberty, and your own property. What they're actually doing is hiding behind a title and creating a society of slaves and masters. Because if you do not have a right to secure your own life, if you do not have a right to secure your own property, then you are enslaved to whomever you're relying on to do that for you.
Only a Marxist organization would fail to guarantee its constituents, whether people or nations, the right to keep and bear arms and the right to own and register private property.
You see, that's what's wrong with the human rights agenda for the United Nations. They establish government as the masters over the people, where the U.S. Constitution establishes the people are the masters over government.
Given this, and a long chain of other abuses, the United States should resign from the United Nations and suggest that all other nations that believe in private property rights and the right to keep and bear arms also resign. If the principles of capitalism, free enterprise, and individual responsibility really are better than the principles of socialism, central planning, and collective punishment, then let that be demonstrated to the world.
But we don't even have that. We have crony capitalism, which is corporatism here in the United States and really worldwide, anywhere where they say capitalism is practiced. Certainly, we wouldn't want to descend down the path of socialism, because that will take us into totalitarianism even faster, because that is the central control of resources and the distribution of those resources by the state itself. So you're going into a much more totalitarian direction when you go toward the direction of socialism and central planning.
We had a League of Nations, then a United Nations. Maybe humanity now needs an international forum based on the 10 amendments in the U.S. Constitution, rather than the 10 planks in the Communist Manifesto.
I think we establish a new body, international, but much more limited in its scope. And this would be the United Democracies. And only those countries who regularly elect their governments by universal secret ballot should be allowed to belong. That way you exercise constraint and you prevent the body from being captured, as the UN has been captured by communists. Any constitution that loves its people enough to allow them to vote for the governing class, that and only that should be allowed to belong to the United Democracies.
Agenda 21 is a United Nations plan launched in June of 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Billed as a plan to address global environmental issues, Agenda 21, in effect, is a plan to dominate all aspects of human life by placing a command and control structure around all planetary resources. Under Agenda 21, the U.S. Constitution, American national sovereignty, and constitutionally guaranteed inalienable rights would be eliminated and replaced by a secular, Marxist world order controlled by a power elite of multinational corporations, international bankers, and NGOs. Already, due to Agenda 21 and its spawns, we have seen the destruction of the American middle class, stagnant wages since 1971, and a deindustrialization of over 50,000 factories across the United States. GATT, NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, the North American Union, and the European Union are all spin-offs of Agenda 21. These free trade laws have transferred trillions of dollars out of the U.S. and into communist and socialist third world countries, as well as communist China.
You know, there are a lot of things that are considered to be unsustainable under this Sustainable Development Plan. One of those things, of course, is your unrestricted use of water and energy. Because, you know, you're going to have to pay the true cost of water, which could be a huge amount of money. And this is the way that you restrict individuals in their use, is that you raise the costs of whatever it is that they're using to a point where they're not able to use these things anymore. This will be restricted and is in fact now being restricted under the United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development Plan.
Under the banner of social equity, one of the pillars of Agenda 21, massive redistribution of wealth has already rendered many of America's activities unsustainable, hence targeted for elimination by 2030. Among these activities are single-family homes and suburban communities, crop irrigation, pesticides and commercial fertilizers, livestock production and most meat consumption, privately owned automobiles and especially the internal combustion engine, fossil fuels for energy production, personal travel and air travel, most forms of mineral extraction and timber harvesting, dams, reservoirs, golf courses, ski lodges and vacation resorts. Human population, such slated for reduction below 1 billion people.
The globalists' true agenda for Agenda 21 is control of the population of the planet. Now they know that they can't control 7.5 billion people, so what they want to do is reduce the population of the planet to under 1 billion, a far more controllable number. When they have done that, they think the billion that they will have wound up with will be concentrated in these mega cities, easily surveilled, and therefore they will basically be able to control all of humanity.
Although Agenda 21 was never ratified by the Senate as required by law, 95% of all federal regulations are tied to UN Agenda 21 as sustainable development policies that target American sovereignty and the American dream.
Agenda 21 targets the sovereignty of any nation and every nation in which it operates. The ultimate goal of the United Nations through Agenda 21 is to transfer as much sovereignty from a particular nation to the United Nations as is possible.
Agenda 21 is a direct threat to the U.S. Constitution because it erodes national sovereignty, it erodes state sovereignty and local control. You have a third party, a foreign element, coming into the towns and counties and cities and implementing something that was written up at a meeting in Rio de Janeiro in 1992.
Either the U.S. Constitution is exceptional or it isn't. If it really is exceptional, should we, the people, encourage the other 194 nations of the world to follow a Pied Piper of some Marxist world order? Or should we offer something better? Let's see how many of the 195 countries on Earth will migrate over. Millions, if not billions, already want to migrate, emigrate, and even sneak into America. We must have something the world wants.
Well, obviously, we don't like the idea of a global government. We don't like the idea of a powerful few running mankind. We like the idea of nationhood, and we always have. So we have all my years working as the originally a young staffer in the Birch Society and working my way up the ladders and becoming president of the society for about 20 years. Our attitude is very simple. If we can wake the town and tell the people the conspiracy will be opposed, then we won't have to worry about it anymore.
I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon.
It's time to cut off the head of the beast. Sure, take state and local action, but Agenda 21's cancer may have spread too far into the U.S. body politic. Thus, as the John Birch Society has been advising for decades, get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of the U.S.
The United States should withdraw from the United Nations. I think
the United States should expel the United Nations from U.S. soil. So I'm always very much in agreement with that philosophy, as articulated so well by the John Birch Society over the years. The UN has produced nothing positive for the United States, in my view. The United Nations, of course, is an attempt at globalization. So when you look at the principles and the ideals of the United Nations and compare those to the principles and ideals of America, they are polar opposites.
So yes, if we removed ourselves from the United Nations would find itself in rather difficult circumstances. And I think we should, because the United Nations in most respects has failed to do what it promised to do. And it has advanced a socialistic program everywhere in the world that it's had an opportunity to do so, which is directly contradictory of our way of life and our governmental system. So we're essentially in the position in remaining in the United Nations and promoting its activities and financing its activities in essentially undermining our own way of life.
Capitalism creates wealth. Socialism creates poverty. The Frankfurt School's long march through cultural institutions has almost destroyed American academia, the media, and even the clergy. The United Nations' long march through the economic and political institutions has almost destroyed free market capitalism and limited government.
This nation is the greatest republic on the earth because we have had a written constitution that has helped us to keep at bay the avarices of men in power who want to concentrate power into their own hands.
Let us be clear. The source of human rights is God, not the state, not the UN. The individual is supreme, not the group. Humanity advances through voluntary action, not coercion. Property is owned privately, not by the state. No one should have a monopoly on a nation's choice of money. Laws should be equal for all, not favor the power elite. Power should be wielded for defense only, never hate or aggression. Leadership should be by persuasion, not by coercion. The UN's agenda is a smokestack technology. The world needs fusion, solar, and probably Tesla technologies. The youth need hope and opportunity, the kind only a free state with an exceptional constitution can deliver. Any other agenda is an agenda for world domination, a Marxist world order. Any other agenda is an agenda the founders of the United States would find totally and completely unsustainable.